United States Army General DeWitt, the commanding general of the United States Pacific Coast, appealed to Ottawa for aid in the aerial defense of Alaska at the time of Japan's invasion of the Western Aleutian Islands. In response, RCAF headquarters ordered 111 Fighter Squadron to dispatch 11 Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawks from RCAF Patricia Bay near Victoria to Alaska. The fighters flew inland via Prince George to Fort St. John the morning of June 3, 1942, arriving at Fort Nelson the next day. One P-40 had mechanical problems and stayed at the fort until June 6th. The 10 others departed Fort Nelson on June 5th for Whitehorse via Watson Lake. To expedite American aircraft to Alaska for the Lend-Lease program to Russia, the United States Army established the 7th Ferrying Group early in July 1942 at Great Falls, Montana, with detachments at each of the staging units along the way. These detachments were each a part of the 383rd Air Base Squadron under the command of Captain W. Luker at Edmonton. At Fort Nelson, 9 enlisted men of the 7th Ferrying Group, under Lieutenant Bob Wade, arrived in late July 1942. The detachment's primary task was to expedite the flow of U.S. Army aircraft to Alaska. RCAF Squadron Leader A.C. Heaven arrived at Fort Nelson to take command of the station in July 1942, and in September, the RCAF took over operational control of the Fort Nelson Airfield. Department of Transport radio operator Bill Wiley arrived at Fort Nelson in September on board a Lockheed 18 Lodestar. Wiley recalls the winter of 1942-43 was a cold one. They ate with mitts and parkas on and slept the same way. No running water was available. On one occasion, a temperature of minus 41 Fahrenheit was recorded in the dining room. Wiley recalled that in mid-1943, the original runway was gravel. A new paved runway had been constructed, but was not to be used until the pavement had cured. Radio man Larry Higgins was on duty when a flight of United States Army Air Force Curtiss P-40s was arriving and wanted to use the new runway. The flight leader convinced Higgins to allow a landing, but on landing, the first 3 aircraft's wheels sank 6 inches into the pavement. Each ended up on its nose with bent props. The authorities found out. Higgins was transferred. Major General John Peter Mackenzie, the Canadian Army Inspector General, arrived at Fort Nelson at 9 p.m. August 12th from Norman Wells in an RCAF Lockheed 10A Electra. The aircraft had been struck by lightning, burning off its trailing antenna and disabling its radio transmitter and compass, as well as leaving burn marks on the left wingtip. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, the United States Army ceded the Canadian portion of the Alaska Highway to the Canadian government. The Canadian government made the highway accessible to the public in 1948. In mid-November 1945, RCAF and United States officers met in Ottawa to discuss the transfer of responsibility for both the Alaska Highway and the airfields of the Northwest Staging Route in Canada. January 1st, 1946 was selected for the handover. By spring 1946, the RCAF had assumed full responsibility for the Fort Nelson Airfield. By 1947, the entire station was manned by the RCAF. Throughout the war, Canadian Pacific Airlines serviced the community largely on military service contracts using Fort Nelson's first terminal, which was the airfield's military hangar. The RCAF began testing various aircraft for cold weather potential at Edmonton during the winter of 1945-46, when it established the Winter Experimental Establishment. But that winter was mild. At the end of the season, with little accomplished, the Winter Experimental Establishment dispatched Squadron Leader Stan O'Partridge to assess the cold weather potential of other locations for a detached base. Fort Nelson was chosen and continued in use through the winter of 46-47, testing a variety of RCAF and Royal Air Force aircraft. The following winter, 1947-48, the Winter Experimental Establishment flight moved to Watson Lake in the Yukon. However, the RCAF established a survival training school at Fort Nelson in 1948. During this year, the RCAF station population grew to almost 300. In 1950, construction began on permanent married quarters for 85 married airmen. The PMQs were completed in 1952. By this time, the self-contained station included a fire department, school, theater, hospital, gymnasium, skating rink, and a store. In the early 1950s, the first 5 acres were sold to locals. This marked the start of the community as separate from the military. Oil and gas exploration in the early 1950s provided Fort Nelson with an industrial sector, jump-starting expansion into what would become the village of Fort Nelson in 1971. Beginning on December 2, 1952, the United States Army Air Force conducted Exercise Warm Wind. During a 3-day period, 90 C-119 flying boxcars and 1 C-124 Globemaster passed through with 3,000 personnel. The aircraft arrived 20 minutes apart and stayed for 2 hours. A joint RCAF Canadian Army exercise known as Operation Bulldog, involving 850 personnel, took place at Fort Nelson in the first 6 months of 1953. This exercise included 14 B-25 Mitchell aircraft from RCAF No. 406 and 408 Reserve Squadron, 2 Avro Lancasters from No. 408 Squadron, a Dakota DC-3, and a C-119 flying boxcar. During these 6 months, there were 1,193 aircraft landings at Fort Nelson. Former Royal Air Force pilot Steve Villers and partner Jim Burrows started Northern Air Service at Fort Nelson in 1957. They operated 2 Cessna 180s and later a Norseman. One Northern Air Service pilot was a former Rhodesian, John Merton, with whom aviation author Chris Waite flew during the mid-1970s. On July 1, 1958, the RCAF disbanded its station at Fort Nelson. All buildings, property, and equipment passed to the Department of Transport in October 1958. During the next few years, most of the former wartime buildings were demolished or sold. In 1960, the Air Traffic Tower and Operations Building were destroyed by fire and later replaced. The runways and parking ramp were upgraded and resurfaced to accommodate larger and heavier aircraft in the mid-1960s. Northern Rockies Regional Airport, also known as Fort Nelson Airport and YYE, is 7 kilometers or 4.4 miles east-northeast of Fort Nelson. The airport is a Tier 2 regional airport facility. Central Mountain Air provides scheduled service, and Villars Air Service operates charters from Fort Nelson.